That's my wife waiting in the lobby. Offered Okay. Well, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this event, first live event for, I can't remember how long, we had a conference, was it? For the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fictions. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to be joined in conversation with Alwyn Turner, a colleague from Humanities from the Department of History. Alwyn is published widely, as I'm sure you know, on British music, on military music, and is it now a quartet of books on the late 20th century?
A 4-volume trilogy.
The most recent one is out, is it not?
It is,
so
indeed. Get
that on your Christmas lists. But Alwyn has also written The Man Who Invented the Daleks, which what brings us here. We've missed one anniversary, as last year was the 45th anniversary of the first appearance of Terry Nation survivors, and next year's the 25th anniversary of Nation's death. So we're kind of halfway in between, but it was kind of probably wasn't in the best of taste to do a session like this during a global pandemic. But now that we're kind of still in a global pandemic, here we are. So I'm delighted that Alwyn agreed to have this conversation. So what we'll do is we're going to talk for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we'll throw it open to questions. So if there's anyone in the ether who's got questions, if you can type them into the comments bar, we'll read them out. I mean, if my children might be listening as well, but they won't have any intelligent questions anyway. So we'll start. So Alwyn,
should we start with the survivors?
Yeah, let's start with survivors. So.
Still a great title sequence.
It's one of the most terrifying pieces of television this side of Threads, I think. So, Alwyn, I suppose we just really start with, we'll assume that everyone in the room knows what Survivors was. Is that a safe enough assumption? So, Terry Nation then, how does Terry Nation get to worrying about a global pandemic in the 1970s? Where's Nations from, and where's his career taken him up until this point?
He gets to it by coming from comedy, obviously. That would be the obvious route. Back in the 1950s, he's born in 1930 in Cardiff, and by the mid-1950s, he's keen to become a success. He wants to be a performer. He thinks he can be a comedian, but decides instead to turn to comedy writing, which is it's just what people did. I mean, it's one of the great ambitions of the time. It's turns up in The Angry Young Men all the time. The Hurry On Down by John Wayne and Billy Liar by Keith Waterhouse. They end up, you go to London to become a comedy writer. That's one of the things that you can do if you're a reasonably creative working class kid. And so he does, and he goes to London, and the BBC. He goes to the BBC and offers his services as a comedy writer, and they send him to see Spike Milligan, who's just set up Associated London Scripts, this little agency for comedy writers. And Milligan takes him under his wing, and he starts writing for radio. And he's not very good, to be honest. I mean, he's not a good comedy writer. The Associated London Scripts you got set up by Spike Milligan, Eric Sykes, and then the team of Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. 4 of the greatest comedy writers that Britain's ever seen. And then they attract in people like Johnny Spate. Really terrific writers. And Terry Nation is way, way down the bottom of the pecking order. And he gets not very good gigs. He does write quite a lot. I mean, he writes about 100 episodes, on often collaborative, for various comedians, but they're not they're not very impressive somehow. But he falls in with Tony Hancock, who has just sacked Galton and Simpson as his writers and needs somebody else. And he writes a bit for Hancock, and I mean, it's better than the earlier stuff that he'd written, but it's still not vintage Hancock. It's when Hancock has moved to ITV. And seems to be set on that. And then this offer comes up to write for this kids' science fiction show that the BBC is keen to launch, and that kind of takes them off into a completely new direction.
So how is this kind of partly failing comedy writer? Is it just that the production team are so desperate by that point? They're looking for scripts, or how does he get into Doctor Who? He
has written, by that stage, he started to write a bit for television, and he has written some adaptations of science fiction stuff. But there's not original stories. He's adapting Philip K. Dick and Isaac Asimov and a couple of other lesser writers. I think it's the first screen production of a Philip K. Dick story. And whether they're any good is very hard to tell, because obviously none of it survives. Right? You know, the same problem that we always have with this period of British television. Nobody was expecting any of this to matter. It's once it's broadcast, it's finished. That's the end of it. Wipe the tapes and put something else on. So whether it's any good is very hard to tell. But he had been knocking around enough that people had him in mind that he could do science fiction, even if he was, I'd say, mostly adaptations at that point. And he turned it down. I mean, he scorned the idea of writing for a kids' TV show. It was really no interest to him. But then he had a big falling out with Tony Hancock, because everybody had a big falling out with Tony Hancock. He was impossible by that stage. And he stormed out. They were on tour together. And he was basically his babysitting Hancock. Hancock was not using any of the stuff that he wrote. Hancock was going back to his comfort zone of the same gags that he'd been using in the early 50s. And they had this big falling out. Terry Nation storms out and gets the train back to London, and then suddenly realises he hasn't got a job. So he uncancels the cancellation, as it were, and accepts the job of doing the writing for this show, which is going to become Doctor Who. But he's one of the first to be invited. They invite several people to submit stuff to it, and he still doesn't take it seriously. It's really of no interest to him, which is partly why it becomes successful, I think, because in between him accepting the commission to write a storyline for Doctor Who, which has not yet been broadcast, he gets offered the job of writing some jokes for an Eric Sykes variety show. It's going to be broadcast from a ship. And that's the important gig as far as he's concerned. Eric Sykes means something. This show that's nobody's ever seen doesn't mean anything at all. So he figures that if he just knocks out the Doctor Who script as quickly as possible, he can get on to the real work of writing some gags for Eric Sykes. And he writes a 7-part series in the space of a week and gives it very, very little thought. And I think that's partly why it is so successful, because it is speed written. And he's not thinking about it. He's almost like he's bypassing his conscious editorial brain and just getting, you know, and that becomes the Daleks, the first Dalek story. And I in an attempt to understand why the Daleks are so popular, I think that is part of it, is that he's not really thinking about it. He doesn't take it seriously and is therefore pouring out of his subconscious almost these slightly nightmarish figures that don't really make any sense.
And Raymond Cusick's design, of course, is
the design is very good, and all Doctor Who fans that I've ever met since I wrote this book are very unhappy that Terry Nation made a fortune out of them, and Cusick made very very little, because Cusick was on staff and Terry Nation was not.
He gets a BBC badge. I think he gets the £300 extra payment. But
he got an ex gratia payment to thank him for the contribution. But meanwhile, Terry Nation was making literally millions. But But that again was completely accidental. I mean, that's part of the joy of this stuff, is that the BBC used to have writers on staff. And so when Nigel Neal wrote Quatermass, I mean, this extraordinary work that is then picked up by Hammer and turned into movies, Neal made nothing out of that because he'd been paid his salary as a BBC writer. And then the BBC decided to change that and have freelance writers. And Nation was one of the first to sign one of these new contracts. And his agent saw a clause about copyright and just crossed it out. And then there's this sudden success of the Daleks. All these people want to make merchandising out of it. And nobody knows who owns the copyright because there is no contract on that. And so the BBC and Terry Nation agree that they will split it 50-50. And when the Daleks become the biggest merchandising explosion that the BBC's ever seen, he's making a killing on. I mean, he's getting very little for his scripts, but the merchandising is what makes him a millionaire. And the BBC learn from that, and obviously don't do contracts like that anymore. They stop. But he's the one who kind of who benefits from it. And yes, sorry. Ray Cusick designs the Daleks. Yes, the basic concept is there in Nation's writing. He knows that the important thing is they don't have legs and arms. Basically, that this is going to be a new type of robot / cyborg that is not based on the human form, and that's the important bit, I think. And then, I mean, it's Cusick who designs the wooden skirt and the rubber at the bottom and stuff. And that's I mean, obviously it's a great design, but it could have gone in other ways, and I still suspect the Daleks would have made it. I don't think it. Maybe it's because I spent 18 months of my life immersed in Terry Nation, but I do think he's the one who should get the credit for it. And actually, if there is anybody else beyond Terry Nation who gets the credit, it's the people who are doing the voice. The voice seems to be much more important than the visuals. The fact that you can do an impression of a Dalek, anybody can do an impression. A 5-year-old can do an impression of a Dalek. That's the kind of thing you need. Yeah. When you're in the playground, you want to be able to play about and I am a Dalek, and you can. And so yeah, it's television. There is no one creator in TV. It's a collaborative medium. Everybody has bits to do. The script editor improves the script, particularly the way the Daleks speak. Terry Nation's original Dalek script, they're quite verbose, and they speak in full sentences that are grammatically correct. And it needs a script editor to chop them down into these staccato rhythms. So, I'm not denying Cusick's.
No.
I spent too many times with fans who say, and Cusick did all the work and Nation nicked it all. Up to a point.
So Nation makes a lot of money, and you have Dalek Mania there, 64 through 65.
Yeah, that's when it's really peaks. I mean, the first story is 63, but it's when they come back that really matters.
And that's the sense of a returning villain and a kind of a super villain. And then Nation doing some work for ITC. Then is he? He's getting involved with. Yeah,
he'd gone to work. ITC, which was Lou Grade's production company, had. Was doing shows like The Saint that he wrote for, and then The Baron, which is not well remembered at all, but I rather liked. I think it's quite good, The Baron, but it didn't work, mostly because it was a rubbish American actor in the lead role. I mean, kind of by definition, he wasn't a great actor. Otherwise, he wouldn't be in Britain.
Yeah.
Any American actor in Britain is not in the top league. Otherwise, they'd be making some proper money. But The Saint is still very good, I think. And he was very good at that stuff. He was good at action-adventure things. And I think that's what he does for Doctor Who as well. I think the Daleks are... It's not science fiction, I don't think. He's not really interested in science fiction. He's interested in those action-adventure heroes. And I think it's striking that the best Dalek stuff that he wrote was in the John Pertwee era. And John Pertwee is an action-adventure hero. He's not that dissimilar to The Saint. somewhere between the Satan and Jason King, possibly. But yeah, he was writing for all those action adventure shows, Department S, and
Is he script editor on the Avengers as well at the end of the run?
The final series of the Avengers, yeah, the one that killed the series, I guess.
Yeah.
Wasn't so successful in America. But yes, I don't think he'd written anything for it before, as far as I recall. But he was roped into doing that. How much he was actually the script editor, I don't know. Because I mean, Brian Clemens kept a very tight rein on that show. It was his baby, and I suspect that Nation was he wrote some of the episodes, but I'm not sure that he was really doing much script editing, to be honest.
So you mentioned America there, and of course ITC always looking at that American market, and then Nation himself tries to take the Daleks to America, doesn't he? At the end of the
well, that's the other great dream, isn't it? If the great dream of the 50s is I'm going to go to London and be a comedy writer, the great dream of the 60s I'm going to be big in America, and particularly after the Beatles, and obviously this is what you want to do. And yeah, he tries. He's very keen to split the Daleks off from Doctor Who, and to some extent succeeds. I mean, the two movies with Peter Cushing as Doctor Who rather than the Doctor. I mean, the second one doesn't even mention the Doctor in the title. It's just Dalek Invasion Earth, whatever year.
2150.
21, yes.
Giving myself away.
And so yeah, the Daleks do get top billing there, and he has a West End play about the Daleks that doesn't feature the Doctor. And he's licensed the rights to the comic strip that turns up in TV Century, TV 21, whatever. He does various bits, and there's a couple of books that are about the Daleks. And he wants to separate them out because obviously he can make more money on them that way, but also it's then his creation. I mean, because however big the Daleks were, and for a while, at the peak of Dalek Mania, they are bigger than the Doctor. They're bigger than the show. But they are still part of the show, and it's not his show. And he still hasn't created his own show. He doesn't run anything. He's not he's not in a position of Brian Clemens, who has the Avengers to himself. And I think he needs that. As any creative artist would. He's making a lot of money. He's well known. He's become famous, and he's being interviewed by serious newspapers and glossy magazines. And he's bought himself a big house in the country all on the back of the merchandising rights. And he wants to be. He wants to have his own program, and the Daleks is the obvious one to go for. And yeah, he gets into negotiations with American TV companies, and it doesn't amount to anything, and probably entirely rightly, because the Daleks, bless them, don't have star appeal. I don't think they are brilliant as the opposition, but I mean, what are you going to do with an entire series of these people? You know, I mean, on an American show, 26 episode series. With I mean, what, the two Daleks talking to each other? I mean, they're not that attractive, and they are so inflexible. Which is the appeal of them, is that they are so single-mindedly evil and vicious. That's great, but there's no light and shade. There's no character to it, and I can't see how you would actually turn it into something unless you spent a vast amount of money on it. And those comic strips are really good because you can do anything on that, and they create an entire empire with different grades of Dalek and social structures and all of that. But to do that on screen would be prohibitively expensive, even for American TV, let alone for British. And actually what he was trying to do was to do a British series that they could sell to America. He wasn't trying to do it with American money. He was trying to persuade the BBC to do it. And they looked at the price tag of even what he was proposing and backed out of it. They weren't prepared to go for it. But as I said, I just don't see how you turn them into something. You know, they're not lead characters. They are the best enemy characters, and they are extraordinary, but they are so limited. And I think Nation must have known that, because the standard format for Doctor Who stories at that point, apart from the historical ones where the BBC wanted to get educational, you would have an alien life form. And every one of the Dalek stories, you have 2 alien life forms, because the Daleks are not sufficient in themselves. And so you get, the first one is you have the Daleks versus the Tars. The Daleks' invasion of Earth is not an alien life form, but you have the Robo-Men, who are the humans who have gone to the dark side and are part of the Dalek Empire, and they're effectively an alien life form, even if they're not quite. And I think, as I say, he knew the limitations of them. That's why he always had another species to play off as well. Them as star characters, I'm not sure it would have worked, really.
So that doesn't work out. So then he's back here, and we're into the early 70s, and he seems to turn towards self-sufficiency and a concern about the end of the world, and he starts to formulate what will become survivors. So what's the step that takes him to turning up at the BBC to go, hey guys, here's my series?
Well, he's been trying it, and he's the meeting where he pitches the survivors is called Beyond Omega, I think, isn't it? The first draft of it, first suggestion rather. And the meeting where he pitches that, which is very early on, is in 1971. He's also pitching this other idea of the what becomes the amazing Robert Baldick, which is makes it onto a pilot, but is never turned into a series, which is a shame, because it's potentially very good. And then there's also this other one, this post-apocalyptic, the world's virtually all the population's been wiped out, and he doesn't get much further than that, really. I mean, and the BBC initially commissioned both a script for each of these 2 projects, but he's feeling pressured, and he only does the one. He can't fit the other one in, and the one that he goes for is the amazing Robert Baldick. So it's not as if Survivors was the burning idea in his head. This is the one I've got to do, because given a choice of 2, he jettisons that, and it takes him another couple of years before he comes back to it. But it does kind of fit in with a lot of his other stuff that he's already done. I mean, it fits in with the Daleks, where the Daleks start with this post-apocalyptic story on the planet Skaro, these 2 races that have destroyed the planet through neutron war. He is interested in ideas of societies that have collapsed, and then that becomes quite a big deal in the early 1970s with the first big environmental boom, which dies off once recession gets going properly in the late 70s, and people decide they've got other priorities. But at the beginning of this 1970s, when ideas of conservation and environmental damage are becoming fashionable,
we see that, I think, in Doomwatch then. Very early on, the BBC seems to be in there, no? Because that's Kit Pedler, isn't it?
Yeah, Pedler, and that predates. And yeah, it is something that's in the air at the time. And he's still trying to get a show of his own, something that says series created by Terry Nation. And he thinks it's going to be Robert Baldick, and that doesn't work. And so he goes back to this. There are various other things that he's trying. I mean, it's not as if he's single-mindedly pursuing this one vision. He does have other ideas of things, a detective show, and which doesn't happen at all. But I think it's something that kind of the times seemed more and more appropriate as he went on. As I say, his first pictures in 1971. By the time it appears in 75, I think, isn't it, the first broadcast? It has become more of an issue in society, and a lot of Terry Nation stuff he does talk about what's happening in the world. You know, I mean, there is a very contemporary element to his stuff. So that first Daleks story, when it was about the neutron bomb, there was a lot of discussion of the neutron bomb around at that particular moment. The first Salt Treaty was signed when he was writing the script. So he does like to bounce ideas off current concerns and issues, and Survivors becomes that. And I think is one of his best, isn't it? Things just kind of come together and it's 1975. He just has this wonderful year when he writes Genesis of the Daleks is on television, which is his best Dalek story, and Survivors starts the same year. And it's like he's finally kind of he's got his own show, Survivors, created by Terry Nation. And yeah, so I think it's a terrifically good show that survives.
So I mean, it's got his name on it, but you know, very quickly he loses control of the show, doesn't he? We'll pick up the differences with Terence Dudley. So what is it about that show? Because you know, there are issues around the production, aren't there? I think that they have to move when it's been produced. So it's moved to later in the year, and
because it's the 1970s
so
and there was a strike.
Yeah.
It's kind of absolutely typical of the time that that delays the production, and it has this enormously wonderful impact. That although I mean we just heard the music to the theme music, that's the only music, which I think is just brilliant. There is no incidental music in Survivors because they didn't have time to commission it because of the strike and the delayed production. They didn't have time to commission a score as well. And so it's quiet, and it makes it really scary and intense. You start with that, which I think is a great theme tune, but that's it, and you got yourself hyped up into it, and then quite a lot of Survivors is emptiness, and the empty countryside and empty streets, and nothing on the soundtrack, and that makes it really quite eerie.
It's quite striking as well, I think, because Caroline Seymour as Abby Grant is the lead character, which is unusual for the time. And I think I read that she's the highest paid actress at the BBC at the time for that role. Okay. But she's also aware that she's not really a BBC type, and she runs into trouble. So I mean, I wonder if you could take us through some of the casting, because I think Greg is originally meant to be American, isn't he? And then Ian McCulloch can't do an American accent.
and possibly again, this is Nation thinking that he might be able to flog it to America if we put it in somebody that they can identify with. But you're right. I mean, the fact that the lead character is a woman is unusual. I mean, he does write. He goes on to create Servalan, who we'll come on to in Blake 7. But I mean, these are good female roles. There's at a time when BBC was not noted for great female roles outside of comedy.
Because there's a great piece of misdirection in the first episode, which I'm sure you'll remember, that Peter Bowles is there, and who's going to kill Peter Bowles, and yet by the end he's dead and the house is burning down, and she cuts her hair, and so this kind of Margaret Ledbetter character heads off in a car to find her son.
Yeah,
and in this new world.
We start the first shot, isn't it? Is of her
on the tennis
practicing tennis in her own with a serving machine. Well, I don't know. You have to speak to somebody new about tennis. Anyway, but it is pure middle class stockbroker belt kind of world, and as you say, Peter Bowles is there, which is wonderful, because who doesn't love Peter Bowles? And then he dies, and that kind of sets the tone for it. There's a bleakness to this that is really quite extraordinary. That I mean, Peter Bowles is not as big then as he's going to become, but even so, he's a familiar figure. You don't expect to see, if you see a married couple in stockbroker belt Surrey, you don't expect him to be dead by the end of the first episode somehow. And yes, and then she, as you say, she then has to go off and is worried about her son who's at boarding school, and so she has to go and see if he's survived as well. Because she gets the plot is obviously, as we know, is there's this epidemic which is probably bubonic plague, but it's never specified. But they have buboes under their arms and stuff. It's presumably related to. And she is infected and wakes up 5 days later to find her husband dead. And yeah, I mean, that's a hell of a thing to put in an opening episode, really. And she has survived, and therefore thinks, well, maybe others have.
Because there's a real thing about loneliness and being on her own in that first episode, isn't there? That is she the last to survive? Are we looking at some sort of a meagre man? And then we go into the second episode in Greg. But Jenny, of course, in the first episode, isn't she? There's kind of a parallel plot developing there. And when the remake is made in the 2008, is it? There's another piece of misdirection, because of course Jenny looks like it's being played by Freema Agyeman, who at that point is untouchable because she's been in Doctor Who, and she's dead by the end of that episode as well. So they've learnt that lesson there. But that same sense in which anyone could be killed off, and so this is a very scary world. And then, I mean, how does that first series pan out then, Alwyn? How do we go from Abby cutting her hair and driving off to, well, Abby leaving the series, of course? Well,
yeah, I mean, by the end she's gone, but that I think the early episodes are probably the best thing that Terry Nation wrote. I think there's a depth to his writing here. I mean, Terry Nation is not the greatest writer who's ever worked for television. He is very good, and he occasionally excels himself, and I think on that one he does. The beginning of Survivors is a really nice piece of work. Because he has these various strands of people who he then brings together, and the interaction of those is intriguing. What he's interested in is how you rebuild a society, and he sets up various alternatives of people who are trying things, and we're following Abby, and then, as you say, Greg and Jenny, who attach themselves to Abby. Abby is very clearly the leader of the group, and they're the nice ones. And then there's the horrible ones who we encounter from time to time. The ex-trade union leader who runs a private army and is busy shooting people because he says that martial law had been imposed, and he's the one who's taken up the reins, and it's up to him to do so. And you get the idea of these small communities of people coming together and trying to find some way that they're going to work. Are they just going to rely on the stuff that exists? I mean, the huge stockpile. This is before just-in-time buying by supermarkets, when they've actually got proper stocks and everything, and that can last you for a long time. But the thing that interests Nation is when you run out of that stuff, how are you going to make anything for the future? Because we have become so removed from the stuff that we use that we don't know how to do it. I mean, even more so now, obviously. We're sitting with a laptop in front of us. I mean, maybe you, but I would not be capable of making this laptop, let alone working out how to work the internet from scratch. We have become so removed from the things that we use every day that when that entire support structure is taken away, what is left? What are we actually capable of as individuals? Because we no longer are individuals. We are the accumulation of generations of experts who have made things for us. The fact that I can turn a switch on the wall and an electric light comes on and banishes the night is phenomenal. I don't know how to do that. I know how to switch. I've got that far, but that's about it. But the idea that I can turn on a tap and clean drinking water comes out is a miracle, and that I can flush a toilet and my waste will be taken away and disposed of. Well, I mean, not at the moment, obviously, but properly, in normal circumstances, will be disposed of safely, as opposed to just being pumped out. All of that stuff, the structures that have been built for us, the infrastructure, and the knowledge that has gone into that is way, way beyond anything that a human being can do, or even a small group of human beings can do. And I think that's what interests Nation is how do we even begin to consider reconstructing that stuff?
He does seem fixated on that, doesn't he? Because in the Radio Times interview, publicity for it, he talks about I think it's a wooden duck, and he says, could you cut the tree down? Could you make the iron? And that conversation is repeated when Abby gets to the school, and it's the actor who plays Dr. Hardwick in Doctor Who, the teacher who's going to go away and die because he's deaf. She has the same conversation, and she says, this generation put man on the moon, and yet we're more helpless than, I think, cavemen is what she refers to. I mean, the second episode is interesting because, exactly as you said, there's these discussions about what the new society will look like. So you have George Baker's union official, but you also have Anne with her trailer full of goodies. Yeah. And she imagines that people will work for her for some of her goodies. And so there's this attempt to continue. She's kind of an anti-Abby in that respect. I think she's had this very pampered life. Yeah. And then she's got crippled Vic, and she abandons him. So there's kind of a brutalism is creeping in there already.
Oh yeah, no, it is very bleak. And a lot of the other people, Abby is obsessed with this technology bit. As you say, with that conversation with the teacher at the school, she becomes then fixated on that side of it. And the others seem to be more worried about how we reconstruct society as a social structure. The George Baker, Arthur Wormley is the character, which is a kind of nice conflation of Arthur Scargill and Joe Gormley. And the ex-trade union leader who is interested. He says his great gift is leadership and organisation. I mean, well, that's not what Abby's interested in at all. She's interested in the reality of how do you actually survive day to day on this, not who holds power. And so there are various, the different things. And as you say, I forget her name again. Anne Trant or something. Who has just stockpiled a whole load of stuff, but why she thinks that's going to work, I don't know, because presumably there's a whole load of other stuff in the shops still.
I think it's because the city's become too dangerous, because they think in lights of London, I think there's dogs and rats, and because Jenny is warned to get out of the city because there's nowhere to bury the dead, that typhoid and the rot, that you can't go into the city.
An open cesspit,
that's it.
Isn't it? Yeah. And the city plays very large in Abby's thinking. That the city is like a baby. It has to be fed. It has to be watered. Its waste has to be taken away, and it does nothing. It just sits there. And that's how helpless we are. And all of which is perfectly accurate, obviously, and perfectly genuine. I have no idea how you rebuild these things. And one rather hopes we don't encounter it, because it's going to be, if we have to rebuild society from scratch, it's going to be a hell of a long time before people need my skills of writing books about old TV programs. I mean, I'm going to be useless for generations.
Learn to use a shotgun, I think, Alan, is the mess of that. Now, unlike Blake 7, where Nation ostensibly writes all the episodes in the first series, although I think some of them, Chris Boosh is probably
people rework a bit. Yeah.
He only writes 6 scripts for this, and they become the basis for the book, which we'll have to come on to, I think, because the ending of the book is particularly bleak. So he brings in Jack Ronda and Clive Exton. And is there a sense in which you get these kind of competing visions across that first series, or is there kind of cohesion?
I think so. I mean, not Clive Exton so much. I mean, who is an interesting figure. I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because it's a rare one where a publisher came to me and said, "Do you want to write it?" And even rarer that I said yes. What intrigued me was that Nation is just one of this group of people who are writing for the same shows. They're all writing for ITC, they're all writing for BBC, they're for Doctor Who, they're all doing that sort of stuff. And Clive Exton is one of the best of them. He's very good, and I think he fits in. One of the reasons he doesn't create his own shows particularly is because he is very, very adept at fitting into other formats. But there are other competing versions of what Survivors should be. Most notably from the producer who wishes to take it into less bleak territory, I think. I mean, Nation's vision is almost entirely dystopian. There's very little sense of hope in any of it. I mean, however much Abby is an attractive character and she seems to be building a little community that seems to be quite nice, it's still ludicrously fragile and prey to the people who are happy to shoot. And then there's the need coming from elsewhere to reshape this program and make it not quite so bleak and turn it into a slightly cozier version of a kind of rural life rather than just this hopeless existence that will presumably be wiped out in due course.
Because I suppose, apart from the first episode, the most famous episode in the first series is probably Law and Order, which isn't, I don't think, written by Nation, where there's been this discussion in the first few episodes about the re-establishment of law and order, and like George Baker's going around shooting people and they find the looter who's hanged. And then, of course, violence comes to this little happy community because Abby lets them, they all get drunk. And there's a rape and a murder, and the wrong person is convicted. And it's essentially they shoot Benny from Crossroads, don't they? And then BBC's go-to Welshman turns out to be the rapist
because Private Cheeseman says so.
Yeah.
And I mean that adds to the bleakness, I guess, doesn't it? The idea that even these people are capable of a miscarriage of justice on that sort of scale, and somebody has lost their life as a result. There's not a lot of cheer in it, really, is there?
No. So Terence Dudley tries to turn it into a kind of cosy catastrophe, because I think he does. Isn't there an early clash with himself and Nation that Terence Dudley thinks the BBC will carry on broadcasting as society collapses?
Yeah, that was the first argument. Terence Dudley being the producer,
but he's also kind of actually a script editor as well, I think, because two of them have their scripts changed, their names on the script.
Yeah, so. and Nation is this is a big undertaking for Nation. They are longer episodes than the Doctor Who ones, and they're not adaptations like The Saint and The Baron, where he's taking somebody else's story and reworking it. He's creating this stuff from scratch, and he is aware that it is his show. It is created by Terry Nation. And therefore he puts a lot of work into the writing in a way that he doesn't always with all of his commissions. And so he's at home a lot writing this stuff and doesn't have the kind of control that he feels that he ought to have over what's happening on the filming. And he's kind of removed from it. And yeah, there's the dispute where Terence Dudley says, that even in this catastrophic situation, the BBC would still be broadcasting, and Nation is convinced that that's not the case. I think actually Nation's probably wrong, to be honest. I suspect the BBC would have carried on in such a situation because the government would have insisted upon it, and they would have kept going even when the government ceased to exist.
So. But Dudley wins this clash, doesn't he? Because does Nation walk away, or is he forced out?
I think he effectively walks away. I mean, he would feel his constructive dismissal, but he does walk, and the show carries on without him, and continues for it's 3 series, and it does all right.
Is it as good without him, though?
It's not, but there are some very good episodes. I mean, I do think there's some nice stuff to come, but it kind of loses its way because it loses the sheer vicious bleakness of it all, and without that, it's an entertainment and it's good, but it had a darker side, and particularly given that it was on, BBC One pre-Watershed, it had a darkness that I think was unusual for the time, and that's what's I think has stayed with people more.
But because it's Terry Nation's survivors, and because he writes those 6 scripts, and because we know he's got a good agent, he's able to take the story in a different direction himself in the novel. So Terence Dudley's, I mean, Dudley's quite a polarizing figure anyway, isn't he?
Well, yeah, but also he has to take it in a different direction in the novel, because he only has the rights to his 6 episodes. Other people have created characters that he can't use.
So where does this bleak vision go in the novel? How bleak is Terry Nation going to get?
With the spoiler alert.
Spoiler. You can get it. You can get it on Kindle now, and you can get the sequel to it by someone else who's written it. I don't know who's written it. So
we don't really know who wrote the other one. In the novel, Nation had this vision that what he wanted to do was take it away from England. This was if the population of the Earth, because we assume that this has happened across the world, that's the whole point of the title sequence, we assume it's happened everywhere. The population is so much smaller, why would you want to be in this country where it's quite hard to work the land when you could be in the Mediterranean where it's really quite easy? I mean, not that I've done either, but I'm told. And so he had this idea that what it should turn into is like a great trek where Abby will lead her group across the Channel, and they will go down through France, and they will end up in the Mediterranean, possibly even further, and move to the east. And obviously that's not going to happen on TV. The BBC aren't going to fund anything anywhere near as extravagant as that. But he does have that idea that he tries to introduce in the book, and actually the book is not great. It would be better if he'd followed that through properly, but he doesn't get that far. He gets them as far as Dover, and quite a few of the group then sail, and Abby is still behind, and she finally meets her son, who has survived, and this is the great thing that has been driving that. The whole first series is supposed to be about her quest to find her son, and in the novel she does, and he shoots her by accident. Admittedly, he doesn't know that it's his mother. It's not, it's more Oedipal than that. But it's suddenly what I mean. Yeah, this is about as bad as it can be, really, because this is worse than Peter Bowles. This is Abby, and we followed her through the entire book, and then she's gunned down at the end. It's a terrifically depressing ending. It's really, I mean, it kind of makes it, but there's too much stuff earlier on that you feel that he could have developed further. But and then the second novel picks up with her son and his career, and it's not Nation's work. And it's quite intriguing. They end up in Wales, and it's quite a nice bit of Welsh literature. It's actually the second novel is probably better. It's kind of more coherent, but not one of Nation's.
So Nation then goes to Blake 7, which is camp but has this incredibly bleak opening episode carrying on this. So how does he go from? So obviously, the clash with Terence Dudley, Survivors carries on with Dudley's vision, and then Nation, he still has good credit at the BBC, and so he pitches them Robin Hood in space, or he doesn't.
Yeah, he variations on.
Yeah,
and it is supposed to be yet another thundering good yarn, because that's what he does. He does adventure stories, and that's how he pitches it. But it is. It's a very dystopian setup to it. We have this character Blake, who we are told in flashback some 4 years previously had led a rebellion against the Federation that governs all of space. This dictatorial system that we don't really see very much of, but we know is oppressive. And Blake has led a rebellion against it and failed and been caught and brainwashed and beaten until he appears in a show trial repenting, and then he is brainwashed again to remove the knowledge that he has ever repented, let alone that he has ever rebelled. And gradually people tell him, because there is a resistance movement, and they want Blake because he is the one who led the rebellion, and he's a big symbol, he's important, and they want him on side, so they explain to him what has happened, and he gradually realises that it is true, and he tries to make a nuisance of himself again, and they frame him for molesting children, and suddenly we've got paedophilia in the middle of this, and again this is kind of prime time BBC One stuff. You think this is a man who's been brainwashed twice and is now being accused of the most heinous crimes, and then the series is just bleak again. I mean, sorry, I keep on coming back to the same word. It just is. The casual killing of cast members is really quite frightening in it. Nobody is safe, including Blake, who gets killed at some point. Is named in the title, and he's not safe from being bumped off because it will make a good story. I mean, there's an honesty to it. I think this is how life is. Just because he's the hero doesn't mean to say he's going to survive the episode.
Twice, in fact, he's killed.
Yes,
he does the. Yeah. Is he really dead? And then they blow his stomach open in the last episode.
Indeed,
but Nation doesn't write that final episode.
No, he's gone by then. He writes the entire first series because he's learned his lesson from Survivors, that if he doesn't write it, somebody else might write the wrong thing. So he insists on writing all 13 episodes of the first series, and then he contributes to the second series and a little bit to the third, and that is expected to be the end of it.
Yeah.
But it comes back for fourth series, and by then he's gone. He's nothing to do with it at all.
Does he still have oversight over it in the way that he's meant to be given the okay for Dalek scripts?
He's no, he doesn't have any control. Chris Boucher kind of takes over and determines the course of it, and is very good at it. I mean, the later series are very good. It does have strong camp elements, partly because Servalan is very camp. This kind of wonderful dominatrix figure who sachets around in skin-tight white dresses and stilettos, and is just wonderfully cruel and capricious. Just before Margaret Thatcher comes to power, and clearly is probably responsible for Margaret Thatcher winning the 1979 election. We needed a strong woman leader at that point, and Thatcher was as close as we were going to get to Servalan. Shirley Williams wasn't going to make the grade at that point. But it carries on with that, with cast members getting slain left, right, and centre, and it carries on with that feeling that actually you can't rely on anything.
So that's,
and I don't know any other series that does that. I mean, a popular TV series that is quite so ready to kill its lead characters.
Not Blue Peter, anyway.
No.
So where does Nation go after?
Grange Hill would have been a different story altogether.
Danny Kendall, of course, is not a spoiler there. So where does Nation go? So I mean, these are three major programs in the 1970s that Nation is involved with. These are three of the big shows on the BBC. So he comes back to Doctor Who, Genesis of the Daleks, which he does write. It's not Robert Holmes' script. Let's nick that one straight away.
He does write Genesis of the Daleks. The other ones for the Doctor Who in the 70s, not great, but they're all right. But Genesis is genuinely good. Survivors is great. Blake 7 is I think probably still our most venerated sci-fi show.
So where does Nation go then? Because he has some relationship with MacGyver, bizarrely enough.
Well, he goes to America. The reason he's not here for the fourth series of Blake 7 is he's moved. He's decided he's going to go to Los Angeles and become a player in American television. And he originally goes there for 2 months in 1980. It's going to be a 2-month stay, and he stays there until his death, 16 years later. And during that time, he does very, very little indeed. He has an involvement in MacGyver, but it's very early on, before MacGyver becomes as big as it did become. And he only writes, in total, he writes the, they call it the Gambit, before the title sequence in MacGyver. And I think he does 4 or 5 of those. So, I mean, a total of 20 to 25 minutes worth of script for MacGyver. A couple of other bits. He writes a not good movie that stars Bob Hope. But basically doesn't. I mean, he has a very nice life. He is a very wealthy man. He's living in a very agreeable world, and he is friends with famous and successful people who know his work. But his career is effectively over. I mean, it finishes in 1980 when he goes to America. There is nothing of any significance that comes after that. So his body of work is essentially about 7 years worth of radio comedy, and then 15 years from the first Dalek story through to series 3 of Blake's 7. But in that time, I mean, there's I don't know, 120, 140 TV episodes. I mean, there's a fair body of work that he's managed to put together. And the best of it is very, very good indeed, and has lasted rather well, and keeps on being revived in different ways. The fact that the Daleks are still with us is an extraordinary thing. I mean, they are. I think they are the most durable TV creation that Britain has come up with, in that they are not dependent on an actor. They just exist in their own right. Anybody can be inside one of those things. They're operators. They're not actors. They exist, and they have a power and a longevity that great myths do. And it is one of the great myths.
Which is presumably why the production team was so desperate to get them, because when Robert Sherman was here 7 years ago, he went through how he got the call from Russell T Davies and said, you might have to take the Daleks out of that script and put something else in. Presumably, without the Daleks, there's no real point.
Yeah, and it is something. Writers are not that keen on the Daleks. Many Doctor Who fans are not very keen on the Daleks. They are seen as being simplistic and one trick, and what's the point? And yet they are still there because they're needed. They still exert an influence on children. And I think that's one of the reasons why Doctor Who fans aren't very keen on them, is that they liked them when they were kids. And now they look at them as adults and think, well, yeah, but there's nothing to it. And they're slightly embarrassed about the fact that they did really, really like them. And so they kind of turn that into an animosity, I think, sometimes. And they are, they're not as sophisticated as some of the other creations of Doctor Who. And yet they're the ones that keep on coming back. And certainly you would struggle to get the media on side without. When it was proposed that Doctor Who was coming back, it was originally suggested that they wouldn't have the Daleks because the Terry Nation was dead by that stage, but the estate wanted too much money and we might not be able to afford it. And this became a massive story in itself. And the Sun runs one of the Sun Says campaigns. We must have the Daleks back. Non-fans, people who are not hardcore Doctor Who fans, cannot imagine the series without the Daleks. Hardcore fans would like to see it without the Daleks, I suspect.
When Nation died and the Doctor Who magazine, they ran a piece about him, and I think it was a Jackie Jenkins column at that time. And the usual gamut of, was he that good? And he was grasping, and they see things in the paper, and they're always going to cost you. And then they realised they were wrong, and they thought, well, what should we watch to mark his passing? And they went through the usual thing, and it ended up as first episode of Survivors. It wasn't Doctor Who at all. It was his Cozy Catastrophe. It's not cozy at all. I mean, would that be right? That's his major work, do you think? Or his best work, maybe.
Objectively, yes, except that the Daleks are the ones that are going to last, and whatever it is now, 50 odd years more than, they are still with us. That it. If they hadn't have been, I would not have been asked to write a book about Terry Nation. If it hadn't been for the Daleks, if it had been based on, however, I do think the Survivors is better.
Yeah.
I think those first 3 episodes of Survivors is brilliant, and in a time of COVID, it suddenly looks even more terrifying. That whole thing that he's basing it on, that it would be more terrifying than bubonic plague, because that could only travel at the speed of a horse, whereas nowadays it will travel at the speed of a jet plane, and it will be all around the world before you notice that it exists. Turns out to be the case, and to scare people. And as I say, I think there's something about the scripts are very good, but it's also, as I said at the beginning, the sheer emptiness of it. The fact that you have this empty countryside with nothing on the soundtrack. And to me, that's when the revived version, when they brought it back a decade or so ago, they brought it back in, and it has, which so much modern television does, a soundtrack that tells you how you're supposed to feel at every particular moment. And this constant barrage of music that is supposed to, and it becomes melodrama. I mean, literally melodrama. Musical drama. It is it batters you into you must feel this now. And to me, that doesn't work as well. And maybe that's just because I'm an old man and I remember old television. But I also think it's the stuff that dates very rapidly, because the sounds of that are dated already. Yeah. That soundtrack feels like it's over a decade old. And it doesn't leave enough room for the viewer, and I think, as I say, the spaces, the emptiness of Survivors is what really makes it haunting.
I suppose because they're forced to do outside broadcasting, aren't they? From the middle of it, the time's against them, so everything's on location. I suppose that aids this sense of emptiness and openness, and that it's not in a studio, so it looks more realistic.
And there is some. And again, it's something that Nation had used before. The second Dalek story, Dalek Invasion, is powerful because it has empty streets of London, and that's hugely effective. And it's the first outside filming I think they did on Doctor Who was for that story. And emptiness is a normal, recognisable world without people in it. Is just disturbing, and Survivors does it remarkably well.
Well, let's bring some other people in case there are any questions. Are there any questions for Alwyn while we have him here? Andrew.
Thanks very much to both of you for a really interesting discussion. I wondered, when I was listening, and Paul as well, I guess, in terms of thinking about it, I was just listening recently to an interview with Georgia Pritchett, who's one of the writers on The Thick of It and Veep, and then now the big American show Succession. And she talks about the idea that you've got the big American show where it's all comedy writers. And I wondered, when you're talking about somebody like Terry Nation, who is this comedy writer suddenly, turning his hand or, suddenly converting himself, is there something about that shift in genre that you think really speaks to, I guess, the strength of that writing, or something that carries across from a kind of a comedy perspective in a sort of different genre?
I'm not sure, because the comedy, the writing that Nation that has survived of Nation's comedy era isn't. I mean, it's really not good. It really isn't. I mean, that Hancock series that he wrote 4 episodes of, and is the best stuff that he wrote, I think. But it's never been rescreened, and it's not been rescreened because Roger Hancock, Tony Hancock's brother, owns the copyright, and he won't let anybody see it. You know, I mean, I managed to get a bootleg DVD of it when I was doing the book, but Nation is not. He's an odd figure because everybody says what a lovely chap he was, and he's bouncy and optimistic, and he's cheerful all the time. He's never depressed. He's never miserable, and so he obviously thinks he can write comedy. But actually, it's the disparity between the character and these terrible dystopian visions that he has that makes it, I think. Whereas it doesn't lend him. He's just jovial, and jovial is not the same as comedy. I mean, you know, there's a reason why comedy writers and comedians are depressing buggers. Maybe you need that kind of contrast somehow. That he is at his best when he's being miserable and going against type, as it were. I think.
Here and then Naomi. Is here? Yes. Yeah.
You said about the latest adaptation of Survivors, which had Heather Graham, I think it was, as Abby, and they sort of tried to make it more modern and go down the baddies were the biological experimenters. You didn't like the music for it, but did you think they'd made a good fist at trying to bring it back in, bring it to the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, you could see what they were doing, and you could see why they jettisoned the trade union leader for a start.
Yeah.
They don't have as much resonance as they used to in the 1970s.
They had some strong,
but I don't know. I thought
strong female characters,
yeah.
Because the kind of the feudal system was led by a female character.
I thought the first it ran for 2 series, I think, didn't it? And the first one I thought was strong, and then the second one it felt to me like they weren't quite sure what they were doing with it. But I don't know that it's going to be remembered very much, to be honest. I think it's one of those shows that's kind of come and gone, and I mean, I guess that's often the case with trying to revive things anyway, isn't it? You know, it's how many people are going to remember Martin Clunes' version of Reggie Perrin?
They didn't explore the themes about the sociological themes, the technological, how are we going to adapt, you know, the simplest thing like a fork. Those things didn't come across quite so strongly. Yeah. And the emptiness that you said. I mean, you said about the emptiness. I remember mostly the crows, because the references to bird flu later on. So yes. It was all in there, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I guess as well also because we are even more technological now as a society, it doesn't look quite. It's easier to take things away and look scary. So when the mobile phone network collapses in the revived version, well, yeah, I mean, I can see that we are dependent upon this new technology, but it still doesn't get back. It means we're not getting to the core of it. The Nation was interested in of the basics of it. We're still stuck at, well, we've lost mobile phones. Well, you know, that takes us back to the 1990s then. You know, whereas Nation is interested in going back to, you know, as I say, the
salt and soap and
yeah, and how do you make a candle? Yeah.
Exactly.
I think part of the issue with that remake, of course, is that it gets tied up in what's caused the plague, and it's Big Pharma. So if there were a hooky version of it on YouTube, there would be a market for it now for people who are, you know, are skeptical about what caused COVID. But I think also, isn't it that Abby and her son have got a natural immunity to it, and they're being hunted by Big Pharma. So it's a different type of narrative to this one. There's not. This is more about we have to rebuild society. So there are interesting competitions about how you view that. So it's kind of there's a philosophical discussion going on in that first series of Survivors. I mean, it ends up. Then they end up in a valley in Scotland where there's a hydroelectric power and lead is overseeing in the third series.
The end of the third series, yeah, and the power comes back on.
Whereas that's far more of a
Nation
thriller.
really hated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose Garland's War in that first series, that's the Nation episode, isn't it? Because it's the action adventure and it's stealing cars, and whereas the remake is a thriller. I'm not sure Survivors originally is a thriller. There are thriller elements, but it's more.
But it's also not science fiction because it is a recognisable. This is now, and now we're taking all the people away. And I'm not sure what that is. A future history
or speculative fiction to get the title of the centre in. Naomi, your hand was up.
Thank you very much. I grew up in Canada, so unfortunately I missed it. But it reminds me of a couple of old programmes I've seen lately. Threads, 1984 film, which is just absolutely harrowing. And I wondered if there were, post-nuclear Britain, and you follow a character through, and you identify with this woman, and you keep thinking that the years are going to go by, somehow she's going to find somewhere. But anyway, I don't think I want to give a spoiler. No spoilers to it. But I recommend that to anyone who hasn't seen it. But I wonder if there are any connections in terms of people who worked or influences, people who worked on Threads. But also, I recently saw an M.R. James adaptation from 71 or 72, and it reminded me of it when you mentioned the emptiness. So there's a stillness about it, about the aesthetic of television at that time. But I don't know if it was just M.R. James or if this was an aesthetic. That there were these sort of just these tableau shots, especially of the forest. And so it's really very effective in creating a sense of suspense, because you were just really waiting for something to happen. It was just the simplest thing, but it was extremely effective. So yeah, I just wanted to you could talk a little bit
that would be appropriate, I guess, for M.R. James, where everything is there. There's one little thing that is just really disturbing, deeply horrible, but not quite. I'm not sure that it was that common. I mean, the pace of television was certainly slower. But had there not been the strike and they'd made Survivors in the normal production period that was scheduled for, they would have had music on it. It wouldn't have been anywhere near as dense as the music is now. Doctor Who from the period did have incidental music. It's just not very much, certainly compared to now, where it's almost continuous. But the emptiness is, I don't know. It's an image that keeps on coming back. It's there in War of the Worlds, in the empty streets. It turns up in Day of the Triffids and the Poison Belt by Conan Doyle. This idea of human habitation without the humans is just one of those things that is deeply, deeply unsettling. And interestingly, in Survivors, is kind of the reverse of what he's talking about. The talk is, how do we have human beings without all the structures of society and civilization? But the look of it is the structures of society and civilization without the people. So, and it kind of, I don't know, it just feels that it's beautifully balanced and appropriate.
There are any more questions? While we have Alwyn here, we can learn everything about Terry Nation. The man who invented Survivors. You can go, that was the title. It had to be the Daleks.
It did, yeah. You've got to sell the thing.
This one's a bit niche, but Terry Nation owned 4 of his own Dalek props, which were like repainted constantly, modified. I think one ended up showing up in Planet of the Daleks, and there's been a bit, and there's people have searched ages. One is confirmed to still exist in private collection, just barely, but there are 3 still out there. Do you?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have them. I don't have them. No, I don't know where they are then. I mean, because he had them when he had his big country house.
Yeah.
And then but then he sold the house when he moved to LA. So presumably didn't ship them out. I guess. I mean, it'd be interesting shipping.
Yeah. One survives, but the painting's completely chipped off.
Okay.
I think. But people have no idea what happened to the other 3.
No. I don't know. They were the ones from the films, weren't they? I think.
Yeah, they were from the stage play originally, and then they were modified to be the film. And then one of them was modified to be the Supreme Chancellor and Planet of the Daleks. And then they toured constantly, being repainted all the time to fit in with the comics. And then one still survives. I'm not sure which one which, but the other 3 are still missing. And people are still trying to find them.
In one of the Dalek books that he writes in the 1960s, as part of the merchandising, isn't it that the Daleks at that point they're the mutated remains of mankind?
Yeah, that turns up, but that's
in Blake 7 as well, isn't it? We're all going to turn back into those weird ape men on the end of series 3. So that sense of the end of mankind that comes back again and again, doesn't it?
And again, I mean, a lot of Nation stuff, you can see where he's got it from. And that idea of a kind of de-evolution is you see it in The Island of Dr. Moreau.
And Time Machine as well, of course.
Yeah, and even in The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, which I'm not sure if he knew because he doesn't seem to make any reference, but the Wellens stuff is definitely a huge influence on him. And there are themes that run across all of the stuff that he writes, I think. He does keep on coming back to the same issues of societies collapsing, what kind of leader rebuilds, what is leadership, and how moral can you be. He likes people being moral and then being put in quandaries of, yeah, but what if? How moral can you be when somebody's pointing a gun at you? So he does keep on coming back to the same stuff. But I think the Dalek books, I'm not sure that he actually wrote any of that, to be honest. I think that was mostly John Whittaker wrote those things. He was not precious about other people doing it, and then would whinge about it afterwards. But, but he was getting paid for not doing any work. So it's hard to complain too much if somebody takes it in a different direction.
So his bleak vision of society, of moral men doing it, so that's all from Tony Hancock, is it? That he's working with this totalitarian figure?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Hancock is big in his life. When he joined up with Hancock, I mean, Hancock was still, he'd just done his the series Hancock on TV. It moved from Hancock's Half Hour and just the Hancock series where he's on his own. And he was huge. I mean, that was the series that produced The Blood Donor, which then became the best-selling comedy record when it was and the record is better than the TV show. And Hancock was the biggest comedian in the country, and Terry Nation was writing for him and hanging out with him. I mean, they shared a hotel room for a very long time as on tour, and he can't not be influenced by that, I think, because he was suddenly bumped up the league, as I said at the beginning, with all these great writers at Associated London Scripts, and he was way down the bottom, and then suddenly he's got Tony Hancock, even though everybody knows that that's a poisoned chalice at this stage.
So is there any truth
to chalice anyway?
Is there any truth to the story that when Tony Hancock saw the Daleks on the telly, he shouted, "That bloody nation, he's stolen my robots"?
It is said that he claimed them, that he had one of their many drunken conversations. Hancock thought that he had suggested these creatures. But since one of the things that he claimed was with ping pong balls cut in half stuck on them, well, that wasn't Terry Nation. So I mean,
Bloody Cusack, Nick.
It is, yeah. Who was probably just hanging around the hotel room, not being drunk and taking notes. I don't know. It didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But Hancock liked to think so. My own favourite bit of that though is if there is an influence, Terry Nation, in his description of the Daleks, what he wanted was these non-human things that glided, and you couldn't see what propelled them. And as I point out in the book, that was Hattie Jakes' stage act at the time. And I think the Daleks are influenced by Hattie Jakes rather than Tony Hancock.
And on that shocker,
bombshell,
we will bring it to a halt. We've worked you long enough, Alwyn. So I'd like to thank you for a fascinating conversation, and to thank you all for coming out for this event. So thank you, Alwyn. We have further events planned. We have Angela Carter conference in, is it March? Heather, is that what we're looking at?
Yes, no, I'm now suddenly gone off.
It doesn't matter. It's March, and then in the summer we have a conference on robots to mark one of the centenaries for RUR, the Czech play Rosamund's Universal Robots. So keep an eye out on the centre pages for more events. We have copies of Grammary at the front if you want to see what else we do. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at some other events soon. Thank you. Thank you.
that was easy. That was easy. Thank you.
Really good.
Didn't use those clips, but always nice to have them.
It's good to.
Makes me feel more